Hey guys, RanterInShades here, exercising my First Amendment rights vlog style, and I know I've been really negligent with this series. There's still a lot of bands I really want to talk about for this, so let's bring this back up, resurrect it, and give you another episode of What's Wrong With for you.
What's wrong with me? You wanna know what's wrong with me? I can ask you the exact same thing. What's wrong with me?
And yes, that's a new intro that I created. Basically, when I thought of the name for this series, I immediately thought of that song, that particular section of that song being used for the intro there, and I think it works pretty well, don't you think? Anyway, band I want to talk about today for What's Wrong With is Pantera. Now, I'm sure a lot of you are probably asking yourself, what? Who hates Pantera? How can anybody hate Pantera? I was wondering the exact same question back in 2010 when someone actually told me to my face that they hated Pantera. Right as I was actually getting this particular shirt, they were telling me how much they hate Pantera. And I was just totally awestruck. Because up until that point, I thought Pantera were basically, untouchable, I guess. I didn't think it was possible for anybody to not like this band, especially if they're a metal fan. I mean, unless you're one of these anti-metal trolls who will usually say they hate a band just to get a kind of reaction. You know the kinds of people I'm talking about. Unless you're one of those, anti-metal trolls who who say they hate a band without really knowing anything about them, I'd understand why somebody would say that they hate Pantera, but this wasn't the case here. So when I went home, because I was at the mall when I was getting this shirt, when I went home I went on the internet and was typing in, how can somebody hate Pantera, or why do people hate Pantera? Something of that nature. So before I get into the reasons that I found as to why some people do not like Pantera, let's talk about what I do like about Pantera, since that's what I usually do first in these videos. So, we'll talk about the musicians first, go over them. Of course, Dimebag is going to be a pretty top-notch guitarist in my book. I think he's a great player, or was a great player. He really knew what he was doing. He was pretty all over the place, and I like that about him, and that's what a lot of people like that about him. He certainly inspired a lot of people to pick up a guitar and try to perfect their craft so they could be as good as him. Phil Anselmo on vocals, got a pretty good growl, pretty nice lyrics, and yeah, he really has a lot to say in the band. I really do like his writing style a lot. Vinnie Paul, I really admire his drumming, his double bass work. I think he's a great drummer. One of my favorite drummers, I would say, of all time. He is pretty fucking awesome. And then Rex Brown on bass, adding into that thickness, the crunch, basically what any bassist would do in that particular slot if they're playing a style like Pantera's. My favorite album of Pantera's would probably be Vulgar Display of Power. Cowboys from Hell comes dangerously close, but in the end, Vulgar Display comes out on top. They're both excellent albums. Vulgar Display just comes up in my book. My favorite song would have to be Cemetery Gates, which is off of Cowboys from Hell. In my opinion, it's one of the greatest metal songs ever written. I just love the fucking intro riff that I'm going to have playing in the background right here. It just sounds so awesome on top of this particular beat. The riffs in this whole song, I think, are really well executed and well played. And of course, this is one of the few songs where Phil Anselmo is singing clean. The lyrics are also pretty cool. They are pretty personal when it comes to Phil Anselmo, considering they were about, friends of his that have died. And of course, the guitar solo in this song, I think, is incredible. And it really speaks for itself as to why not only do I respect Dimebag as a musician, but why lots of other people respect him as well. I understand a lot of people when they say that they think he's overrated just because He died at a young age. I understand that if people think that a musician is overrated because they die young, but just because somebody really likes a musician that happens to have died at a young age doesn't mean that, people should be thinking less of his playing, because he was a great player, and you cannot deny that. If you listen to his shit, you'll agree with me. He's a fantastic fucking player. While I'm at it, let's talk about other projects that are related to Pantera that the band members have been involved in. Obviously, I'm going to be a big fan of Hell Yeah. I think Hell Yeah is pretty damn awesome, one of the best supergroups to have really come out in recent years. I mean, when you're taking sounds from Mudvayne, Nothing Face, Damage Plan, and of course Pantera, you're going to come out with a pretty awesome alternative meets thrash sound, which is pretty awesome in my honest opinion. Damage Plan also, which featured Dimebag and Vinny, and that was the band that Dimebag was playing in when he got shot on stage, unfortunately. I do like Damage Plan. I look at Damage Plan as like the band that almost was. I mean, after Dimebag got shot, they had only come out with only one album, and I look at them as a band that really could have done more. A band that had a lot of potential but stopped after, one of their members died. They could have, done a lot more. Down I also do like, which is while Vinny and Dimebag were in Damage Plan, Phil Anselmo and Rex Brown were off playing in Down. I do like a few of Down's songs. I'm not a huge fan of Down, but what I have listened to from Down I think is pretty good. One other project I'd totally recommend you check out, especially because the concept of this album is so original, it's almost crazy that someone actually thought of this concept. Rebel Meets Rebel. What that is a collaboration between David Allan Coe and the members of Pantera, all of them except for Phil Anselmo, and they refer to themselves as the Cowboys from Hell. On the cover of that album it says David Allan Coe and the Cowboys from Hell, and they make up Rebel Meets Rebel. And the reason why I think that album is so awesome is because it's the only thing in the world ever to label itself as country metal. Think about that concept. It really just makes you curious as to what that sounds like. And it is a really entertaining listen. I'd highly recommend you check it out. Because, come on, with something as original as country metal and as twisted of an idea as country metal, you definitely want to hear what it sounds like, right? So check it out. One thing I really respect Pantera a lot for, and is probably the one thing I respect them the most for outside of the music, is that they came around, they broke out at a time when metal was basically sort of crumbling down, Metal was not really the in thing anymore, grunge was becoming the new thing as far as mainstream rock went, but Pantera were basically around to basically say, nope, metal's not dead. Metal will always be made. We're going to keep making music. And, it really showed because their albums in the early to mid 90s sold pretty well, and they're still considered classic to this day. I mean, the early 90s, from between 91 and 94, I guess, they're usually looked at a pretty stale and bleak time as far as metal goes. The people who usually say that are usually the, disgruntled 80s metal fans who think that anything released after grunge hit big is just, not good at all. But Pantera basically showed everybody at that time that that is not the case. I feel the same way about Dream Theater and Rage Against the Machine, and I guess Alice in Chains too, but that depends if you consider them a metal band. Those bands basically showed everybody, that, grunge can do what it wants with metal. Grunge can do what it wants, but doesn't mean that metal's dead. We're gonna keep making music, metal will live on. And as we all know today, that is certainly the case. And Pantera certainly were around to basically keep metal relevant, keep it alive in the 90s. Oh, another band that I actually think helped keep metal relevant in the 90s and alive, sort of early on in the early to mid 90s is Korn. Korn, I think, also helped a lot with keeping metal relevant in that period of time, which so many people just look at as a sad time for metal. Even though, metal in the 90s, I like 90s metal a lot. A lot of it is really awesome. And the fact that some people think that the 90s is just this bleak and dark and sad time for metal is just blasphemy, especially with bands like Pantera out there at the time. So that's one thing I really respect Pantera for, and with that said, let's get to debunking the flack. I already spoke about how people find them to be overrated or find Dimebag to be overrated. Like I said, it doesn't mean that they're shit musicians, because they're obviously not shit musicians. I just, described otherwise as to what I like about their musicianship, and other people will say similar things. Maybe they'll go into more depth than me, but they're still positive nonetheless. One thing that I want to talk about is how some people think that Pantera were responsible for the Antichrist known as nu metal. Nu metal. Where? Even if you don't like nu metal, you're still acknowledging Pantera as influential. You do realize that, right? And it is true, even outside of nu metal and alternative metal, Pantera is regarded as highly influential. That's a good thing, right? Just because Pantera may have influenced a band you don't like doesn't mean that Pantera should be burnt at the stake. Bands like, Black Sabbath, Metallica, Iron Maiden, Slayer, they've influenced a lot of bands that I'm sure you don't like also, and that may be some that I don't like either. But I don't see you saying, oh, Black Sabbath sucks because they've influenced this band, they're responsible for this. I don't see people doing that. So why all of a sudden, just because it's nu metal, why all of a sudden does that mean that you shouldn't respect Pantera at all? Again, people really need to take into account the impact Pantera had on metal in the 90s. I could pretty much say the exact same thing about the entire nu metal genre, except the reason why I don't is because it basically broke out so much later in the 90s. But it's still the case. Those bands helped metal basically keep its place. It kept it relevant, kept the genre at large alive. And that's one thing I really wish people took into account when talking about bands from the 90s. Maybe even with bands now also. I could argue that, bands like Bring Me the Horizon and whatnot, I could argue that they're keeping metal relevant in the mainstream in this day and age. I could argue that. Another argument I have seen as to why people just, thumb Pantera down is, I'm going to give you a little history lesson here. So, Pantera have been making music since the early 80s. Their first album, contrary to what some people actually believe, came out in 1983. This album is called Metal Magic. Back then, they were releasing music on their own independent label called Metal Magic Records, which Dimebag and Vinny's father was the president of. And they were recording their first 4 albums in their home studio in Texas, and they were basically touring locally at that time. Those albums are commonly referred to as the Glamtera days, because it's a vastly different sound than what Pantera would adopt in 1990 with Cowboys from Hell. And just because those albums are apparently glam, that means they suck, right? Because glam is just so terrible, right? Anybody that plays glam, they're just terrible. Just because they play glam, right? Wrong. Just because somebody plays a certain genre doesn't mean that they suck. Personally, I look at those first 4 Pantera albums as, pretty beyond what some people, refer to as glam. They don't really sound like your typical, Poison and Whitesnake albums. They don't really sound like those at all. To be honest, they sound more like an Americanized new wave of British band, which is actually a pretty cool sound. Even in 1983, those albums didn't sound like your Shout at the Devil, your Pyromania, your Metal Health, or even your Out of the Cellar, which didn't come out until a year later. Those albums sounded a lot more traditional than what some people think of when they think of glam, and their albums actually were really just improving over time. Even by their fourth album, Power Metal, which is when Phil Anselmo became their new lead singer, they were going in more of a thrash direction for that album anyway, and it would totally be solidified with Cowboys from Hell 2 years later. And yeah, those of you who are interested, actually, Pantera's original lead singer on their first 3 albums in the 80s was a guy by the name of Terry Glaze. He has a pretty okay voice, and after he left Pantera and Phil Anselmo came in, he went on to form this band called Lord Tracy, and they came out with one album in '89 called Deaf Gods from Babylon, and it's actually a pretty cool album. I'd only recommend it if you're really interested. But anyway, using those albums that are played in a different style than you're used to, using those as a basis for your judgment is really just stupid. Those 90s albums that Pantera released, the ones that they consider to be their main discography and what a lot of Pantera fans consider to be their main discography, they're still good albums, right? And those earlier albums, those 80s albums, we shouldn't be letting those just cloud our opinions on those later albums that we love so much. We shouldn't let those albums change our opinions and have us think less of Pantera just because they played in a different style. It's really, really stupid to use that as your basis of judgment. And some of the people actually saying that about those albums are usually the people that really only just found out about those albums. And that's an even more pathetic reason, especially if, you used to like the band. You're like, oh, I stopped liking them just because I found out about those earlier albums. They're actually, like I said, pretty good listens. They're kind of hard to find, but they were well worth the download when I found the download links for them. Getting back to the overrated statements, yeah, I don't think they're the greatest musicians ever, but we can't deny the impact they had on the metal scene at that time, and we can't deny their influence on so many bands from so many different styles of metal and rock. We can't deny that at all. That's something we really need to give Pantera credit for, and not just castrate them. We shouldn't be doing that. So that's all there really is to say about Pantera, and here's the part where I ask you, the viewer, what's wrong with Pantera? Please be rational and objective when leaving your thoughts and opinions in the comment section below, and if you feel like it, be sure to request any bands you want to see be tackled in this series, and take care and have a nice day. I'm Shades, and I will see you next time.